Hello and welcome to this demo where we'll continue working with data tables in UiPath Studio. In this demo, we'll extract data from an Excel file, then create a consolidated data table with details about newly hired people. We'll generate their email addresses, update the data table with the email address for each new hire person, and then write the data from the data table variable to an Excel spreadsheet. All set, let's get started. In our project folder, we have a folder named Data, which contains an input and output folder. Inside the input folder, we have two Excel files containing candidates from the HR and PM departments. Let's explore them. The Human Resources Candidates Excel sheet contains 5 columns: first name, last name, department, role, and status. And there are 6 candidates listed. The Product Management Candidates sheet has 6 columns with 6 candidates listed as well. Perfect. Let's rename the main sequence to define email addresses for successful candidates, and also add an annotation to explain better its purpose. Next, let's add a Read Range workbook activity as we want to read the Excel range containing the HR candidates data and store it in a data table variable. This activity creates a data table with columns whose data type is set to object by default. When adding data to these columns and merging them with other data tables, we must consider this. We'll now navigate to the Input folder and select the Human Resources Candidates Excel file as the input workbook path, and type in Sheet 1 as the sheet name. Let's also rename the activity to Read Range Workbook HR Candidates. Now in the Properties panel, under Output category, we must specify the data table variable to store the read information from Sheet 1. Let's create a new variable using Ctrl+K and name it DT HR Candidates. Next, let's add another Read Range Workbook activity. We'll use it to specify the input workbook path for the Product Management Candidates and specify Sheet 1 as the sheet to extract the information from. Let's now create a new data table variable to store our output. We can name it DT Product Candidates. Next, let's open the Variables panel and create another variable that will need to store the output of the merged data table variables. We'll name it DT Candidates. What variable type should we select? Indeed, system.data.datatable. Perfect. Next, we must create a schema of our DT Candidates table, meaning that we'll configure the columns and their properties using a Build Data Table activity. Let's add it and rename it as Build Data Table DT_candidates. Now let's open the Build Data Table window. Adding the HR and product candidates data to this activity's output table requires matching column names and data types. Thus, we'll remove the existing row and edit column 1's properties. Let's name it First Name. What data type should this column be? Exactly, we must set it to Object, and click OK. Now for the second column, let's rename it to Last Name, and set its data type to Object as well. Next, let's click Add Column to add a new column. We'll name it Department and set its data type to Object. We'll perform the same steps to add another 2 columns for the role and status. And then click OK. Our next step is to merge the HR candidates data table with the final data table, namely DT Candidates. For this, we'll use a Merge Data Table activity. We'll specify the DT_HR candidates data table variable as the source and the DT candidates variable as the destination. On the right side, we can see the missing schema action property. It specifies the action to take if there are schema issues when merging the two data tables. Let's leave it set to the Add action. Next, we'll merge into the final DT candidates data table the product candidates as well. Let's add another Merge Data Table activity. For the source field, we must add the DT product candidates variable, then specify the DT candidates variable as the destination. This time, we'll set the missing schema action to ignore because the product candidates table contains an extra column, and we want to ignore it. We don't need it in our merged table. Our next step is to filter the consolidated data table to only keep the hired candidates. For this, let's search for and add a Filter Data Table activity and open the Filter Wizard. We'll add the DT candidates variable as both the input data table and the filtered data table variable. Now for the key element. Since we want to see only the candidates that got hired, we'll make sure to select the Filter Rows tab, as we want to specify that we want to keep the rows that have the value set to hired within the status column. We don't need to make any other changes on the Output Columns tab. Perfect. What we want to do next is to add another column to our filtered data table, where we'll specify the email address of each hired candidate. For this, let's drag and drop an Add Data Column activity. Type in Business Email for the column name, and we'll add DT Candidates as our data table. Now let's move to the Properties panel. The Allow DB Null property enables us to specify whether null values are allowed in the new column for rows that belong to the table. By default, this checkbox is cleared. Let's set it to True, as we want to allow null values. Next, let's add a log message to print the result if the hired candidates were successfully extracted. Now we'll scroll up to the first Merge Data Table activity, add a breakpoint to it, and run our workflow in debug mode as we want to examine the data being added under the DT Candidates variable. If we check the Locals panel and click View More for the DT Candidates variable, we can notice that the business email value isn't present yet, and we have just one row with the 5 values representing the column names. Let's step over this activity and go to the next one. If we check again the values for the DT Candidates variable, we can see that we now have an additional 6 rows representing the HR candidates. If we click Step Over again, we can see 13 rows now, meaning that the 6 candidates from Product Management have also been added to the DT Candidates data table variable. Let's step over to the next activity, meaning that our DT Candidates data table variable has now been filtered out to show only candidates that have the status Hired. And here they are. Now let's click Step Over one last time. We can see that the business email column has been added to our DT Candidates variable. Perfect. Let's continue. The next step in our process is to add the email address for each hired candidate. The For Each Row in Data Table activity executes an action once for each row in a specified data table variable. Thus, let's add it to our workflow. We'll add our DT Candidates variable as the input data table and specify current candidate as the name that we'll use to reference each row in the activities inside the body container. Adding a log message will allow us to track the hired candidate for whom we'll add an email address. We're using the current candidate reference and indicating the index as 0 and 1 within the data table. We're basically saying here that we want the first name and last name values. Since our table contains objects, we need to convert from object to string each value using the .toString method. Next, we want to retrieve a specific value from our DT candidates data table rows according to a specified column. For this demo, we'll use two different ways to achieve this. The first one will be to use a getRowItem activity, while the second one will be to use an assign activity. Let's now add the getRowItem activity. We'll add the current candidate reference inside the row field and specify the column name. Let's type in first name. Now to store the item value, let's open the Data Manager panel and create a new variable. We can name it first name, set the data type as string, and narrow the scope to the body of the for each row activity. Let's add the newly created variable inside the value field of the getRowItem activity and rename it accordingly. Perfect. Next, we'll add an assign activity, as we also want to get the last name of the candidates and store the values to a new variable. Let's now open the Variables panel and create a variable to store the last name values. We'll name it last name, leave the variable type as string, and check if the right scope is selected, namely body. We'll now assign the value for the current candidate row on the last name column to the last name variable. The expression that we'll use for this is current candidate, open brackets, type in last name between quotation marks, close brackets, .toString. Perfect. Now we must assign the email address value for each current candidate row relating to the business email column. For this, let's use an update row item activity. Let's suppose that our company name is Acme. Then our email address could be something like firstname.lastname@acme.com. This means that we must reference the first name and last name variables, add a dot between them, and then add @acme.com. Next, we specify the current candidate row, select to specify the column by name, and type in the name of our data table column, namely Business Email. Let's rename our activity for better readability. For our final step in the process, let's add a Write Range workbook activity, as we want to have a new Excel file with data from our consolidated data table, containing all of the hired candidates along with their newly generated email addresses. Let's browse to the output folder location within the project folder. As we can see, there's no existing Excel workbook that we can use. No need to worry if the Excel workbook doesn't exist. A new one is created with the sheet name value. All cells within the specified range are overwritten and changes are saved immediately. Thus, let's type in the output folder path and then type in a name for the new spreadsheet and the file extension. For example, new hire emails.xlsx. Type sheet1 between quotation marks as the sheet name and add DT_candidates as the source data table. It's important to add the headers from our data table as well. Check the Add Headers option in the Properties panel. And that's it. Let's run our process. If we go to the Project panel and click Refresh, we can see the newly generated spreadsheet inside the Output folder. Let's open it. Great! Everything looks exactly as we intended. This concludes our demo on working with data tables in UiPath Studio Part 2. Think of tasks that require you to work with different sets of data. How can you apply the knowledge and skills gained from this demo to streamline and automate your manual workflows and tasks? Thank you for watching, and until next time, happy automation!